There is a version of the world where none of us are here. Not because of something dramatic, not because of a war that was fought or a bomb that was dropped, but because of something far quieter than that. A decision made in the dark. A cloud moving across the sky at the wrong moment. A man who hesitated when he probably shouldn't have, and in hesitating, saved everything. History, when you look at it closely enough, begins to feel less like a steady march forward and more like a long series of near misses. Moments where the entire shape of the future balanced on something so small, so ordinary, so easily overlooked, that it almost defies belief. And yet, here we are. Which means all of those moments went a certain way. The question worth sitting with, slowly and quietly, is, what if they hadn't? We tend to think of history as something fixed, something settled. We learn about it in books with hard covers and straight spines, and it feels permanent in the way that only written things can. But the people who lived through those moments didn't experience them that way. They experienced them the way we experience our own lives, with uncertainty, with confusion, with the particular terror of not knowing how things would turn out. A Soviet officer sitting alone at a radar console in the middle of the night didn't know he was about to become one of the most important people who ever lived. He just knew he was tired, and that something on his screen didn't look right, and that the decision he was about to make would have to be made very, very quickly. That is where we begin, not with the grand sweep of history, but with the quiet moments inside it. The ones that almost went another way. The ones where the world held its breath, and then, slowly, gently, exhaled. It is worth staying with that image for a moment. The world exhaling. Because that is, in some sense, what every near miss represents. A breath that was held, and then released. And the more you look at history through that lens, the more you start to realize that the exhaling has been happening, quietly and constantly, for as long as there have been humans making decisions under pressure. The thread of our survival is thinner than we usually allow ourselves to believe. But it has held. And that, in itself, is something worth noticing. What Stanislav Petrov did alone at a radar console in 1983 mirrors something that happened 20 years earlier, in a very different setting, under very different conditions. And yet the structure of the moment is almost exactly the same. One person, an alarm, a choice that no one should ever have to make. In October of 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American naval group was depth-charging a Soviet submarine called B-59 that had gone silent near Cuba. The Americans were using practice charges. They were not trying to destroy the submarine, just force it to surface. But the crew of the B-59 didn't know that. The submarine had been submerged for days. It had lost contact with Moscow. The crew was exhausted, oxygen depleted, and increasingly convinced that a war had already begun on the surface above them. The captain of the B-59, Valentin Savitsky, made the decision to prepare the submarine's nuclear torpedo for launch. Unlike conventional weapons, the nuclear torpedo on the B-59 did not require authorization from Moscow. It required only the agreement of 3 men: the captain, the political officer, and a third officer named Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be the flotilla commodore and was aboard for the mission. Savitsky and the political officer agreed. Arkhipov did not. He argued against the launch. He was calm about it, by all accounts, not shouting, not panicking, but firm. He believed the depth charges were not an attack. He believed communication with Moscow should be re-established before any weapons were used. He persuaded the captain to surface the submarine instead. The B-59 surfaced, was met by American ships, and eventually returned to the Soviet Union. The torpedo was never fired. It was later confirmed that the nuclear torpedo on the B-59 was fully operational and ready to use. A single voice of quiet reason, in a sealed metal tube at the bottom of the ocean, may have prevented a nuclear war during the most dangerous 13 days in modern history. What strikes you, when you sit with these two stories side by side, is how similar they are in shape. The same structure, a system screaming, authority urging action, and one person choosing stillness instead. Petrov in his monitoring station, Arkhipov in his submarine. Both of them surrounded by pressure, both of them choosing, quietly, and without fanfare, not to do the thing that the situation seemed to demand. And both of them being right. There is something deeply human in that. Something worth noticing. The capacity to pause in the middle of an emergency and think, really think, may be one of the most important things a person can do. And it almost didn't happen. Not all of the moments that almost changed the world involved a person making a choice. Some of them were entirely beyond human control. Some of them came down to the weather. On the morning of August 9, 1945, a B-29 bomber called Boxcar took off from the island of Tinian in the Pacific carrying the second atomic bomb to be used in warfare, a plutonium device nicknamed Fat Man. The primary target for that mission was not Nagasaki. It was a city called Kokura, a major Japanese industrial and military hub on the northern coast of Kyushu Island. Kokura was chosen because of its munitions factories, its strategic position, and the concentration of military infrastructure in and around the city. When Boxcar arrived over Kokura that morning, the city was obscured by cloud cover and smoke drifting from the previous day's firebombing of the nearby city of Yada. The bombardier could not get a visual lock on the target. Visual bombing was required by the mission protocols. The crew was not authorized to drop the bomb without a clear visual on the target. They made 3 passes over the city. On each pass, the cloud cover held. After the third attempt, low on fuel and running out of time, the crew made the decision to divert to the secondary target. The bomb that was supposed to fall on Kokura fell on Nagasaki instead. Somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people died that day in Nagasaki. In Kokura, people went about their lives. The city survived the war intact. For decades after the war, the people of Kokura lived with a strange awareness of what had almost happened to their city. There is a Japanese phrase that emerged from that history, Kokura no on, or the luck of Kokura, used to describe the experience of narrowly avoiding catastrophe through no action or virtue of your own. Just circumstances. Just a cloud. The people of Kokura didn't do anything to be saved. The cloud did it for them. And the people of Nagasaki didn't do anything to deserve what happened to them. The cloud just wasn't there. There is something in that asymmetry that resists easy explanation and perhaps resists explanation altogether. It is the kind of thing that the mind circles without ever quite settling. What the story of Kokura reminds us is that randomness is not just an abstract concept. It has a shape. It has a weight. It falls on real cities, on real people, on real lives. And when it falls one way instead of another, the consequences ripple outward in ways that no one fully traces. The people who weren't born in Kokura because their grandparents survived the war. The people who were born in Nagasaki and never knew what might have been different. History doesn't only turn on human decisions. Sometimes it turns on smoke and sunlight and the particular thickness of a cloud on a Tuesday morning in August. There are moments in history where what almost happened is so vivid, so close, that it almost feels more real than what did. October 14, 1912, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is one of those moments. Theodore Roosevelt, former president, now running for a third term as a candidate for the Progressive Party, was on his way to deliver a campaign speech when a man named John Schrank stepped out of the crowd and shot him in the chest at close range. The bullet passed through Roosevelt's metal glasses case and the folded 50-page speech manuscript he was carrying in his breast pocket before entering his body. Both objects slowed the bullet enough that it did not reach his lung. Roosevelt, famously, did not go to the hospital. He touched the wound, looked at the blood, decided he was not coughing it up and therefore his lung had not been punctured, and went ahead and gave the speech. He spoke for an hour and a half. He began, according to the historical record, by telling the crowd, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The bullet stayed in his chest for the rest of his life. He never had it removed because doctors determined the surgery would be more dangerous than leaving it in place. What is worth sitting with here is not just the obvious, that a president might have been killed, but the particular texture of what didn't happen. Roosevelt lost the 1912 election to Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's presidency produced the Federal Reserve Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act, and his fateful decision to bring the United States into the First World War. A Roosevelt presidency, a presidency that almost didn't exist even as a campaign, let alone as a government, would almost certainly have looked different. Would America have entered the war? Under what terms? What would the peace have looked like? These are questions that history doesn't answer, because history only goes one way. But they are worth holding in the mind gently, without pressing too hard for resolution. The bullet that hit Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 was stopped by 50 pages of words, a speech he was about to give, folded twice, resting over his heart. There is something almost literary about that detail, something that a novelist would be accused of making too on the nose. But it happened. A man's words, literally, saved his life. And the life that was saved went on to shape a campaign, a party, an election, and a set of political currents that ran through the next decade of American history. It is a reminder that the things we make, the things we write, the things we carry, sometimes have consequences we could never have anticipated. History is full of stories where a single small thing, something almost embarrassingly minor, turns out to be the hinge on which a much larger event swings. One of the quieter examples of this comes from the early days of the American space program. During the development of the Saturn V rocket, engineers at NASA were working through a rigorous series of tests on the fuel system components. In one of those tests, a technician stepped away from a critical inspection to take a cigarette break. While he was gone, another inspector completed the review in his place and signed off on a component that, had the first technician been there, might have been flagged for further examination. The component in question was eventually identified as potentially defective in a later review and was replaced before the rocket flew. The outcome, in this case, was fine. But the point is not what happened. It's the chain of events that had to align for the problem to be caught. A cigarette break, a substituted inspector, a second review that happened to catch what the first might have missed. The entire safety architecture of that moment was built on layers of redundancy and human attention that could, with slightly different timing, have failed entirely. The cigarette break didn't cause a disaster, but it created the conditions in which a disaster almost didn't get prevented. This kind of story, where the near miss is embedded in something mundane, something almost laughably ordinary, appears again and again across the history of technology and engineering. The nuclear power plant worker who noticed an anomalous reading and mentioned it in passing to a colleague. The train conductor who felt something was wrong with the brakes and slowed down even though the instruments said everything was fine. These are not heroic moments in the traditional sense. Nobody is running into a burning building. Nobody is making a grand choice under the Klieg lights of history. They are just people paying attention in the middle of ordinary work, and the world is quietly better for it. What the cigarette break story really illuminates is something about the nature of safety itself. We tend to imagine safety as a state. Either things are safe or they aren't. But in practice, safety is more like a process, a constant and imperfect negotiation between systems and the humans who operate them. The gap between a near miss and an actual disaster is often not a gap of design or intention, but of attention, small, mundane, wandering human attention, which is itself subject to all the ordinary interruptions of ordinary life. Cigarette breaks, shift changes, tired eyes. The world does not distinguish between the trivial and the consequential. It just is, and we have to navigate it as it comes. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip was sitting in a delicatessen in Sarajevo, eating a sandwich and feeling like a failure. Earlier that morning, he and a group of co-conspirators had attempted to assassinate the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The attempt had gone badly wrong. One of the conspirators had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it had bounced off and exploded under the following car, injuring several people. Franz Ferdinand was alive. The assassination attempt had failed. Princip, by his own account, had given up and was eating a sandwich. What happened next is one of history's most astonishing coincidences. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but unhurt, had decided to visit the injured from the bombing at a local hospital. On the way, his driver took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, and then, realizing his mistake, stopped the car to reverse. The car stopped directly in front of the delicatessen where Gavrilo Princip was sitting. Princip walked out, drew his pistol, and shot the Archduke and his wife at close range. Both died within the hour. Within 6 weeks, nearly all of Europe was at war. The wrong turn on Franz Joseph Street is sometimes cited as one of the most consequential navigational errors in human history. And it's tempting to frame it that way, as though the First World War was caused by a missed turn, as though the deaths of millions of people can be traced back to a driver who forgot which road he was supposed to take. But that framing is too simple. The conditions for war had been building across Europe for decades. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was a trigger, not a cause. And yet, the trigger still had to be pulled. Without Princeps stepping out of that delicatessen, without the car stopping in exactly that spot, the specific trajectory of events that produced the July crisis and the subsequent declarations of war might have unfolded differently. Not peacefully, perhaps, but differently. This is one of the things that makes history so resistant to clean interpretation. The wrong turn on Franz Joseph Street matters and doesn't matter at the same time. It was random and consequential and also, in some ways, almost beside the point. The war was coming. The nationalist tensions, the alliance systems, the arms race, the imperial competition, all of it was pointing toward catastrophe. And yet the specific form that catastrophe took, the precise day it began, the particular man whose death started the cascade, that part was determined by a driver who turned the wrong way on a street in Sarajevo on a warm summer morning. These two things are both true. The large forces of history were in motion, and a small human error opened the door. There are moments in history where a single person's decision carries a weight that even they probably couldn't fully comprehend at the time. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy, the largest amphibious assault in military history, was planned, prepared, and almost canceled. Not by enemy action, not by intelligence failure, by the weather. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, had scheduled the invasion for June 5th. The weather that day was terrible. His chief meteorologist, a Scottish RAF officer named James Stagg, advised postponement. Eisenhower postponed. Stagg then identified a narrow window, roughly 36 hours, during which the weather would be marginally acceptable. Not good. Acceptable. He briefed Eisenhower on the evening of June 4th and told him that conditions on June 6th would be passable but unpredictable, and that the window could close sooner than projected. Eisenhower listened to the briefing, sat in silence for what witnesses described as a very long moment, and then said, "Okay, we'll go." Those 3 words set 160,000 soldiers toward the beaches of Normandy. A decision made in the dark, on the advice of a single meteorologist, about a weather window that could have collapsed at any moment. What is less often told is the German side of that morning. The German High Command had also assessed the weather and concluded that conditions were too poor for an Allied invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the German defenses at Normandy, had taken leave to visit his family in Germany and to meet with Hitler. He left because he was certain the weather would delay any Allied action. Many senior German officers were away from their posts that morning for the same reason. The poor weather that worried Eisenhower was the very thing that made the Germans least ready. The conditions that almost stopped D-Day were the same conditions that made D-Day possible. James Stagg's forecast was right about the window. He could not have known for certain. He was working with the tools and the data available to him in 1944, which were dramatically less sophisticated than anything we have today, and he was trying to predict conditions in the English Channel, one of the most meteorologically volatile bodies of water in the world. He made his best judgment and told the truth about his uncertainty, and Eisenhower made a decision that turned on that uncertainty. The invasion succeeded, but the success was not predetermined. It was earned, partially, by a weather forecast that could have gone another way, delivered by a man who was honest about not being sure, accepted by a general who decided that a small window of acceptable conditions was worth the risk of acting. The First World War began in the summer of 1914 and ended on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock in the morning. The armistice that ended the war was signed at 5 in the morning, but the commanders on both sides had agreed that hostilities would cease 6 hours later, at 11. In those 6 hours, knowing the war was over, knowing that within hours they would all be alive and homebound, the soldiers on both sides continued to fight and continued to die. An estimated 11,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing on November 11, 1918. More casualties than on D-Day, on the last day of a war that everyone knew had already ended. The last soldier to die in the First World War is generally believed to be an American private named Henry Gunther, who was killed at 10:59 in the morning, 60 seconds before the armistice took effect. Gunther, who had been demoted earlier in the war for writing a letter home discouraging friends from enlisting, had reportedly been trying to recover his reputation by demonstrating bravery. He advanced alone toward a German position. The German soldiers reportedly signaled him to stop, knowing the war was about to end. He kept going. He was shot. 60 seconds later, the guns went silent. The first soldier to die in the First World War is a more complicated historical question, but the war is often said to have claimed its first casualties almost immediately upon the declarations of hostilities in August 1914. Between those two dates, the first death and the last, lay more than 17 million dead. And what the story of Henry Gunther holds, quietly and without flinching, is a reminder of how the logic of war continues to operate even after the reasons for war have ceased to exist. The armistice was signed. The war was over. And the systems that had been set in motion, the orders, the momentum, the peculiar mathematics of military honor, kept producing death for 6 more hours because no one had found a way to stop them sooner. It is worth considering, from a very quiet distance, how many of the catastrophes in this story could have been avoided not by a single heroic intervention, but by someone deciding to stop sooner. Stanislav Petrov chose not to act. Vasily Arkhipov chose to hold still. The war in Europe in 1918 did not stop until the exact minute that had been agreed upon, and not 1 minute earlier, even though everyone on every side knew it was coming. There is something in that contrast worth holding. The decision to stop, to put down the gun, to surface the submarine, to call the alert a false alarm, seems in retrospect obvious. It never felt obvious at the time. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, a novelist named Morgan Robertson published a short novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. The novel tells the story of the largest ocean liner ever built, described as nearly unsinkable, which strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic on an April night and sinks with enormous loss of life, partly because the ship does not carry enough lifeboats for all of its passengers. The fictional ship is called the Titan. It is approximately 800 feet long, can carry around 3,000 passengers, and is traveling at around 25 knots when it hits the iceberg. The Titanic was 882 feet long, could carry around 3,300 passengers, and was traveling at around 22 knots when it struck the iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912. The parallels are genuinely striking. The names are almost identical. The ships are similar in size, speed, passenger capacity, and the fatal detail of too few lifeboats. The month is the same. The ocean is the same. The cause of the sinking, an iceberg at night in the North Atlantic, is the same. Robertson's novel was published when the Titanic was not yet designed, let alone built. He could not have known. And yet the novel reads, with a certain kind of attention, like a very accurate description of something that hadn't happened yet. After the Titanic sank, the book was reprinted and widely read. Robertson became briefly famous. The story of the Titan became one of the most frequently cited examples of what people sometimes call prophetic fiction. There is a much more straightforward explanation, of course. By 1898, ocean liners were getting larger every year, and the North Atlantic was the most heavily trafficked ocean route in the world. Icebergs were a known hazard. The idea of a massive ship sinking after hitting an iceberg was not a difficult thing to imagine. It was the kind of scenario that maritime safety experts genuinely worried about. Robertson was an experienced sailor who knew the sea. He wrote a novel about the thing that experienced sailors feared. The fact that the novel matches the Titanic so closely is partly due to the constraints of the scenario. There are only so many ways a very large ship can sink in the North Atlantic, and partly due to something we are very prone to. We remember the hits and forget the misses. Morgan Robertson also wrote other novels with other predictions, many of which did not come true. He wrote about naval warfare between the United States and Japan, which did eventually happen, though not in the way he described. He made other predictions that were simply wrong, but we don't remember those. We remember the Titan. We remember the uncanny parallel. We remember it because our minds are designed to find patterns, to hold on to coincidences that feel significant and release the ones that don't, to build meaning out of the material that history provides. And that tendency, that very human tendency, is worth understanding because it shapes not just how we read novels, but how we read everything. Of all the pattern matching exercises that history invites, the one that has captured the most popular imagination is the list of parallels between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. Both were presidents of the United States. Both were assassinated while in office. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846, Kennedy in 1946. Lincoln was elected president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both had vice presidents named Johnson, Andrew Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson. Lincoln was shot in a theater and his assassin ran to a warehouse. Kennedy was shot from a warehouse and his assassin ran to a theater. Both presidents were succeeded by Southern Democrats named Johnson. The list goes on, and it has circulated for decades in books, magazine articles, chain emails, and, more recently, across every corner of the internet. The problem with the Lincoln-Kennedy parallels is not that they aren't real. Many of them are accurately stated, though some are exaggerated or selectively presented. The problem is what they are supposed to mean. The implication, in most of the retellings, is that these parallels are somehow significant, that they point to something, some hidden order in history, some mysterious rhyming of fate. But when you actually examine the list carefully, a different picture emerges. Many of the parallels require very selective framing. The detail that Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy and Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln, for instance, turns out to be largely fabricated. Kennedy's secretary was named Evelyn Lincoln, which is close, but Lincoln did not have a secretary named Kennedy. More importantly, the parallels that are genuine, the election years, the Johnson successors, the Friday assassinations, are drawn from a very large pool of possible data points. If you are looking for parallels between any two assassinated presidents, you will find them, because there is an enormous amount of information about each president's life, and the human mind is extraordinarily good at selecting the details that fit the pattern it is looking for and ignoring the details that don't. This is not a failing. It is a feature. The capacity to find patterns is one of the most important things the human brain does. It is how we learn language, how we recognize faces, how we navigate complex social environments. But it is also how we find meaning where there is only coincidence. The Lincoln-Kennedy parallels are a beautiful example of what happens when a powerful cognitive tool is applied to material that doesn't warrant it. The pattern is there, or at least a version of it is there, assembled from carefully selected data. But the pattern doesn't mean what it seems to mean. It doesn't tell us anything about fate or destiny or the mysterious cycling of history. It tells us something about us, about the minds doing the pattern matching, about the deep and persistent human need to find order in the midst of what is, at its core, a fundamentally disorderly world. And that need, it turns out, has a name and a structure, and it is worth understanding. The tendency to find patterns in random or semi-random data has been studied extensively by psychologists and cognitive scientists, and the findings are both fascinating and a little humbling. The brain, it turns out, is not a neutral observer of the world. It is an active interpreter, constantly working to make sense of incoming information, to find structure, to impose order. This is enormously useful. Without it, we would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of sensory data we receive every moment. But it also means that we see patterns that aren't there, assign meaning to coincidences, and construct narratives out of sequences of events that are actually unrelated. Psychologists call this tendency apophenia, the spontaneous perception of connections and meaningfulness in unrelated things. It is related to, but distinct from, pareidolia, the tendency to see faces and figures in ambiguous shapes, like clouds, or wood grain, or burnt toast. Both phenomena reflect the same underlying mechanism. The brain's pattern detection systems are so finely tuned, so eager to find signal and noise, that they sometimes generate false positives. They find the face that isn't there. They find the connection that doesn't exist. They find the meaning that the data does not actually contain. In the context of near misses, moments where disaster was narrowly avoided, this tendency takes on a particular character. When we learn that Stanislav Petrov didn't launch the missiles, or that Vasily Arkhipov refused to fire the torpedo, we feel something. We feel relief, even though we are learning about something that happened decades ago. We feel gratitude, even toward people we never met. And we feel, perhaps most strongly, a sense of significance, a sense that these moments mean something, that they were supposed to happen a certain way, that the world was protected by something more than coincidence. That feeling is real, but the feeling is not the same thing as the reality. The reality, as best as we can reconstruct it, is that Petrov made a judgment call based on incomplete information and happened to be right. Arkhipov made an argument to a captain under extreme stress and happened to prevail. The cloud over Kokura moved through when it did because of weather systems operating entirely independently of any human intention. None of these things were guided by fate. None of them were predetermined. They were contingent, which is a word that means dependent on chance, subject to other things that might have gone differently. And yet the pattern-seeking brain looks at the sequence and says, there must be a reason. This must have been meant to be. We are still here, so we were supposed to be here, weren't we? There is a specific psychological phenomenon that researchers have documented around near misses, and it is counterintuitive enough to be worth spending some time with. You might expect that a near miss, a moment where something bad almost happened but didn't, would be experienced as reassuring. After all, nothing bad happened. Everything is fine. But research consistently shows that near misses are often experienced as more distressing than clear failures or clear successes. They feel worse, in a specific way, than outcomes that are further from the boundary between good and bad. This is because of a cognitive process called counterfactual thinking, the tendency to mentally simulate alternative versions of events, to ask what would have happened if things had gone slightly differently. When an outcome is far from a critical threshold, counterfactual thinking is harder to engage. But when an outcome is very close to the line, when the bullet almost hit, when the alarm almost triggered a launch, when the cloud almost moved, the alternative version of events is vivid and close. It is easy to imagine, and the imagination of the alternative produces fear or grief or relief so intense it tips into anxiety, because the alternative feels real in a way that more distant possibilities don't. This is why the stories in this conversation have the emotional texture they do. Stanislav Petrov is more affecting than a story about a nuclear attack that was launched and stopped, because the near miss keeps the two possibilities, disaster and safety, in simultaneous view. Both futures are visible, the one that happened and the one that almost happened. And the proximity of the two is what gives the moment its particular weight. We feel the world that was and the world that almost was at the same time, and that double vision is uncomfortable in a way that a single clear outcome is not. The almost is heavier than the either/or. Researchers studying near misses in gambling contexts have found that slot machines programmed to produce near misses, 2 cherries, and then a lemon, almost a jackpot, are more reinforcing than machines that produce clear losses. The near miss makes people want to play again. It says, you were so close. Try once more. This is, in part, why casinos are designed the way they are. But the same mechanism operates in how we think about history. The near miss keeps us engaged. It keeps us circling the moment, running the alternative scenarios, asking what would have happened. It keeps us, in a very specific sense, playing. And that engagement, that inability to look away from the almost, has something to tell us about what we believe about the world. When something goes well, when the bullet misses, when the alarm turns out to be false, when the submarine surfaces instead of firing, there is a version of the story that the mind wants to tell, almost automatically. The version that says, it was meant to be. The world was protected. Something was watching. This is not an unusual response. It is, in fact, one of the most common ways that human beings make sense of their own survival and the survival of things they love. The idea that good outcomes are not random, that they reflect something, some intention or care or order in the universe, is deeply appealing, and it is appealing for reasons that are entirely understandable. Psychologists who study this tendency sometimes describe it as a belief in a just world. The implicit assumption that the world is fundamentally fair, that what happens to people reflects what they deserve, that outcomes are connected to worth or virtue or righteousness in some way. This belief is comforting. It is stabilizing. It allows people to feel that they have some control over what happens to them, that good behavior leads to good outcomes, that the world is not simply operating on the basis of physics and chance in the particular way clouds move over cities on August mornings. The belief in a just world makes the world feel livable, but it also has a cost. Because if you believe that good outcomes are deserved, you are also, implicitly, believing that bad outcomes are deserved. If the world is just, and Stanislav Petrov's decision was protected by some larger order, then what do you do with Nagasaki? What do you do with the 80,000 people who died not because of any decision they made, not because of any particular moral failing, but because a cloud moved and a bombardier got a visual lock and a crew made a call that was entirely within the rules of the mission? The comfort of believing in order requires you to also accept that the order chose them. And that is a cost that the comfort of the belief doesn't always acknowledge. This is not an argument against finding meaning. It is worth being clear about that. Meaning is something that humans make, and the making of it is valuable, and the search for it is one of the most distinctly human things there is. What is worth being careful about is the specific form of meaning that says the world is arranged for our benefit, that the near misses are evidence of protection, that the things that went right were guided, that survival is reward. Because if that's true for the people who survived, it must be equally true for the people who didn't. And the people who didn't survive were not less deserving of a cloud. They were just less lucky. And there is something important in sitting with that distinction, slowly, and without rushing toward resolution. There is a particular trick that hindsight plays on the mind, and it is worth naming directly because it quietly shapes so much of how we understand the past. The trick is this. Once you know how something turned out, it becomes very difficult to remember that it might have turned out differently. The outcome, having happened, acquires a quality of necessity. It begins to feel not just like what occurred, but like what was always going to occur. Psychologists call this hindsight bias, and it is one of the most robust and well-documented cognitive phenomena in the literature. It affects everyone, including experts and professionals who are specifically trained to avoid it. What hindsight bias does to history is particularly interesting. When we look back at the Second World War and see the Allied victory, it is very hard to genuinely feel, from the inside, that the outcome was uncertain. We know how it ends, and knowing how it ends makes the ending feel inevitable in a way that strips the events of their actual texture. The genuine uncertainty, the terrible contingency, the moments where everything could have gone another way. The people who lived through those events didn't have access to the ending. They didn't know D-Day would succeed, or that the weather window would hold, or that the German commanders would be away from their posts that morning. They were operating in the dark, with incomplete information, making decisions under conditions of genuine uncertainty. We read their choices as bold or wise or lucky, but we read them from the vantage point of the outcome, which they didn't have. Hindsight bias has practical consequences beyond how we read history books. It shapes how we evaluate decisions in business, in medicine, in policy, in everyday life. When a decision leads to a bad outcome, hindsight bias makes the decision look worse than it was. We say that the person should have known, that the warning signs were obvious, that anyone paying attention would have seen it coming. And sometimes that's true, but often it isn't. Often the decision was reasonable given what was known at the time, and the bad outcome was the product of uncertainty that the decision-maker could not have resolved in advance. We penalize people for outcomes they couldn't predict, while congratulating people for outcomes they got right partially by luck. The near-miss stories in this conversation are a kind of antidote to hindsight bias, if you let them be. They work by restoring, temporarily, the sense of genuine uncertainty that was present in the original moment. When you really sit with what Eisenhower knew on the evening of June 4, 1944, when you really try to imagine making that decision without knowing how it ends, the inevitability starts to dissolve. The outcome becomes contingent again. The world becomes unstable in the way that it actually is, underneath the false solidity that knowing how it ended gives it. And that instability is uncomfortable, but it is also closer to the truth. The truth is that it could have gone another way. It went this way, and we should be humble about the difference. If hindsight bias makes the past feel more inevitable than it was, then the fear of randomness is what drives us to construct that sense of inevitability in the first place. Because randomness is genuinely frightening. Not abstractly frightening, not philosophically frightening, but viscerally, bodily frightening in a way that almost no other idea quite matches. The idea that the things that matter most, survival, safety, the continuation of the people and places we love, might be determined not by our virtue or our effort or our wisdom, but by cloud cover and damp powder and a driver who turned the wrong way on a street in Sarajevo. That idea is very hard to live with comfortably. Experiments in psychology have shown that when people are exposed to random sequences of events, they become motivated to find patterns even when no patterns exist. The more out of control people feel, the more vigorously they search for structure, in symbols, in rituals, in superstitions, in conspiracy theories. This is not stupidity. It is the mind doing what minds do under threat. When the environment feels chaotic, the brain redoubles its pattern detection efforts. Because in evolutionary terms, the cost of finding a false pattern is much lower than the cost of missing a real one. A false alarm costs you a little time and anxiety. Missing a real predator costs you everything. So the brain errs towards seeing patterns, even where none exist, as a kind of insurance against the alternative. This is why cursed tombs and prophetic novels and presidential parallels find such a ready audience. They are not competing with rational analysis on a level playing field. They are meeting a need that rational analysis doesn't fully address. The need to feel that the world is not simply operating on the basis of chance, that there is something more than chance, that the thread of meaning is real and holds. The comfort that comes from believing in Tamerlane's curse, or in the eerie premonition of Morgan Robertson's novel, or in the mysterious alignment of Lincoln and Kennedy, is not a comfort that comes from understanding. It is a comfort that comes from feeling that understanding is possible, that the world is, in principle, legible, ordered, susceptible to being read. The fear of randomness is not irrational. It is a completely understandable response to the actual texture of reality, which is genuinely more uncertain and more contingent than we usually allow ourselves to believe. The near misses in this conversation are real. The randomness that shaped them is real. And the discomfort of sitting with that randomness, of really sitting with it, without reaching immediately for a reassuring explanation, is also real. It is the discomfort of seeing the world as it is, rather than as we would prefer it to be. That discomfort has a name in philosophy. It is sometimes called the anxiety of contingency. And it is, in its way, one of the most honest responses to reality available to us. What all of these stories, the false alarm, the submarine, the cloud, the wrong turn, the damp powder, the weather window over Normandy, have in common is not just that they were close calls. They all share a particular structure, a decision made under uncertainty, with incomplete information, on a timeline that did not allow for careful deliberation, with consequences that could not have been fully predicted in advance. This is, in fact, the structure of most important decisions. Not just the historically important ones, but the everyday ones. The decision to take a different route home. The decision to mention something that seemed minor. The decision to stop and think instead of acting on the first impulse. What decision science has learned over the past several decades is that the quality of a decision cannot be fully assessed by looking at its outcome. Good decisions sometimes produce bad outcomes, and bad decisions sometimes produce good ones, because outcomes are affected by factors that the decision-maker could not control and could not have predicted. What you can evaluate is the process. Whether the person making the decision had access to the relevant information, whether they considered the alternatives carefully, whether they were honest about their uncertainty, whether they acted within a structure that allowed for course correction. Stanislav Petrov had a good decision process. He assessed the available information, identified a reason for doubt, and chose the option with the lower catastrophic downside. He was also right. But he could have been right for the right reasons and still been wrong about the outcome. That possibility is what makes the story truly frightening. The historian Barbara Tuchman wrote extensively about what she called the March of Folly, the tendency of governments and institutions to pursue policies that are clearly contrary to their own interests, to continue down paths that observers at the time could see were leading to disaster. What Tuchman found was not that leaders were stupid or malicious, but that they were operating within systems that made it very hard to change course. Systems of institutional momentum, of political face-saving, of information filtering that made bad news hard to transmit upward. The individual decisions that mattered most were often not the grand strategic ones, but the small ones. Who was in the room? Who felt safe enough to speak? Who had the authority to say that the direction was wrong? This is what Arkapov's story really teaches, if you look at it that way. It was not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. It was a story of institutional design, of the particular design of Soviet nuclear authorization that required 3 officers to agree before the torpedo could be fired. A design that, in that specific moment, put the right person in the room. The lesson is not that we should be grateful for brave individuals who happen to be in the right place. The lesson is that the systems we build, the rules we create, the cultures we cultivate inside organizations and institutions, these things determine what kinds of moments become possible and what kinds of decisions become available to the people inside them. Small decisions made long in advance shape the large decisions made in crisis. Come back, for a moment, to the image that opened this conversation. History as a long series of exhalations. The world holding its breath and then releasing it. What we have been tracing across all of these stories is the particular thinness of the line that separates the breath held from the breath released. Petrov at his console, alone in the dark, with an alarm screaming and a protocol demanding action. Arkhipov on the submarine, making an argument to an exhausted captain in the middle of an ocean. The cloud over Kokura, moving or not moving based on weather patterns that had nothing to do with the people underneath. The driver in Sarajevo, turning the wrong way on a street. Each of these moments is a place where the line was very thin, where the world on one side of the line looked radically different from the world on the other side. And what strikes you, if you sit with all of them together, is not just how thin the line was, but how often it appeared. How many times the world came close to being something fundamentally different from what it is. How much of what we take for granted about the shape of the present was not guaranteed, was not inevitable, was not protected by any particular force or order or intention, but was the product of decisions made under pressure by imperfect humans in imperfect systems, some of whom got lucky, some of whom were wise enough to pause, and some of whom were simply standing in the right place when the cloud moved. There is a concept in safety engineering called defense in depth, the idea that safety should not depend on any single layer of protection, but should be built in layers, so that if one layer fails, another is still in place. The nuclear command systems that Petrov and Arkhipov operated within both had elements of defense in depth, the requirement for multiple confirmations, the requirement for multiple officers to agree. What those systems did, imperfectly and sometimes by accident rather than design, was create the conditions in which a single person's doubt could stop a catastrophic action. They built in the possibility of the pause. And the pause, in both cases, turned out to be what saved everything. We rarely think about defense in depth when things go well. We think about it afterward, when they don't, when the report comes out and we discover that the accident that happened could have been prevented if any one of 3 or 4 different safeguards had functioned as intended. The near misses in this conversation are the moments when defense in depth worked, when the cloud appeared, when the doubt was voiced, when the second opinion was sought, when the driver's wrong turn happened to put the right person in the wrong place at the right time. The disasters are the moments when it didn't. And the distance between the two, as we have seen, is often smaller than anyone would choose to believe. There is a kind of quiet that settles over you when you spend a long time with these stories. Not the quiet of resolution. None of these stories resolve, not really, because the contingency they point to is ongoing, which means the world is still proceeding on the basis of decisions made under uncertainty by imperfect people in imperfect systems. The quiet is something else. It is something closer to a kind of recalibration, a settling of the sense of how solid the present is, and how easily it might have been otherwise. The world that exists right now, the specific arrangement of cities and borders and institutions and technologies and languages that we navigate every day, is the product of an almost incomprehensible number of near misses and lucky breaks and small decisions made by people who didn't know what they were setting in motion. Petrov went home from his shift and was reprimanded for his paperwork. Arkhipov returned to his ordinary military career. The driver in Sarajevo whose wrong turn started a world war is not recorded in the histories. We don't even know his name. The people who shaped everything were, in the moments that mattered most, just people. tired, uncertain, doing their best, sometimes getting it right. What this suggests about the present, about the decisions being made right now, today, by people in various rooms and corridors and monitoring stations around the world, is something that is worth sitting with without pressing it toward a conclusion. The present is as contingent as the past. The line between one version of the future and another is as thin now as it was on the night Petrov sat at his console, or the morning the cloud moved over Kokura, or the evening Eisenhower paused and then said, "Okay, we'll go." The moments that almost changed the world are not a feature of some distant or dramatic past. They are a feature of how history actually works, which means they are happening now, as they always have been, in places and ways that we will only understand much later, if we understand them at all. And maybe that is where this conversation can rest, gently and without urgency, not with a lesson or a warning or a call to anything in particular, but with a simple and quiet observation. We are here. The world continued. The thread held, again and again, through near misses and accidents and the particular mercy of moving clouds and damp powder and one man's doubt in the middle of the night. We don't know all the reasons it held. We don't know all the moments it almost didn't. We know only that it did, and that it is still holding, and that somewhere in the ongoing, uncertain, imperfect work of being alive and making decisions in the dark, that is enough to be grateful for, slowly and without rushing, as sleep comes.